Hi everyone, today I'll be comparing the Panasonic Lumix S5 with its full-frame 24 megapixel BSI sensor versus the Olympus E-M1 Mark III with its micro four thirds 20 megapixel sensor. And we'll be looking at exposure latitude. Basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a couple of different test scenes and then overexpose and underexpose them by 5 stops in increments of 1 stop each. And then we'll compare them side by side and do a little bit of analysis from there. So without further ado, let's get started. Now for the first test, I'm going to underexpose the scene by 5 stops in steps of 1 stop on each camera, and then we'll compare them side by side. But for each stop that I underexpose, I'm going to adjust in post-processing by 1 stop. So let me show you what I mean. Now here's my Lightroom catalog with the first test scene ready to go. And you'll notice that I've put a star next to each one, and each star represents 1 stop. So this scene here was underexposed by 1 stop, this was by 2, 3, 4 stops, and then I have my 5 stops down here. And then for each scene, take this for example. Since I underexposed this scene by 2 stops, if you look over here at my exposure slider, you'll see that I brought the exposure back by 2 stops in post. And then I also pushed the shadows 100% because I just wanted to see how much shadow recovery we have as well. And I'm going to do that for each scene respectively. All right, now let's look at the first scene here. So again, I have 1 star here at the bottom representing this shot is underexposed by 1 stop. And I shot both cameras at base ISO, 200 on the E-M1 Mark III and 100 on the Panasonic. And as you can see, I locked the aperture at f5.6, and then I only had to adjust the exposure so that they would match. So basically I doubled the shutter speed on the Panasonic to gather a little more light because it has a lower ISO setting. Now if we compare right here in the center, let me go ahead and line these up. I think both cameras did a fine job here, underexposing at 1 stop, then bringing it back up in post. And just ignore any focusing differences. It's just slightly off on each camera. But looking at the detail here, I don't think there's really any problems at all with either image. There's just a tiny bit more noise in the micro four thirds or the E-M1 versus the Panasonic, especially here in the shadow area. But when we back off and look at the scene, I think most of the image pretty much the same. Just a hair bit more noise in the Olympus, but I think both are very usable. Now looking at the next scene, we've underexposed by 2 stops, then brought it back in post-processing. And we'll go to the center of the image here. And again, I think both cameras did a good job at retaining all the color information. And there's certainly plenty of detail. But at this point, you can see the noise is really starting to creep in on the Olympus. Not much. I mean, you really can't tell unless you really go into like this shadow area here, where you can see like this blue-green kind of speckle up in the shadow area. But anywhere that's, you know, relatively illuminated, like here in the colors, it's pretty close. But now when we get to 3 stops underexposed and bring it back in post-processing, even without punching in, I can already see a little bit of difference. The colors are good on both, and I have calibrated for white balance as well. But the noise is starting to make the image overall, make the colors look a little bit off, particularly because of all this blue speckle, blue and green speckle. And when we punch in, we can see, especially in the dark areas, where this blue and green type speckles are coming in, and that's kind of what's affecting the overall color. And again, a little bit of noise reduction would eliminate some of this color shift, but we're going to lose some detail. Not too much at this point. We still have good detail, but we definitely have some strong color noise coming in at -3 stops. Now here at 4 stops, same thing. I think both cameras did a good job with the colors. They still look pretty authentic, But again, the noise on the E-M1 Mark III pulling 4 stops is definitely having an effect on the overall kind of look of the image in terms of color. And it's also starting to really kill some of the fine detail. Like if this was like a bird with very, very fine feathers, we definitely would have lost some of the detail. Like look at the area here where we have the dust speckles. You know, a lot of the dust you can see very clearly over here, but over here it's pretty much been mushed out by the noise. Now at 5 stops, you can see that there's definitely a big difference in the two images, even when we're looking at them in whole. Plenty of noise in the E-M1 Mark III versus the Panasonic is still pretty clean, even though we had to pull 5 stops back from the shadows. So let's just punch in and get a closer look. Again, I think the colors are actually not bad on both cameras. They did a good job at retaining the colors, but the color noise on the Olympus is definitely having an effect on that. But it's pretty amazing how clean the Panasonic S5 is. Even here in the shadow area, we're now seeing some noise starting to creep in. But like in a normal area here, there seems to be still plenty of detail. It's gotten a little bit softer, but it's not bad overall. Now what we're looking at here is actually, I took the same scene and I did some post-processing to bring both images to be as close as possible to each other. And I did the exact same processing on both, just some very, very minor tweaks on the noise and the highlights and shadows, etc. But if we just punch in, and again, ignore the focusing, but you can see that the E-M1 Mark III is now very, very clean. All the way up into here, we still have good detail in the shadows. Lots of good detail here. And then when we get into the hard shadow areas over here, you can see the noise is almost completely gone. There's still a little bit of noise, but it's not bad at all. Like if we look down in here, it looks really good, I think. And then coming over to here, you can see that this processing really cleaned up the E-M1 Mark III to be very, very close to the Panasonic S5. So what did I do exactly? It's very simple. I took the 5 shots from each camera and then I just did an HDR merge in Lightroom and then applied some automatic post-processing and a tiny bit of noise reduction to both. And as you can see, I think really in a blind test, if you looked at them at full size like this, it would be hard to tell the difference. Now in the next test, I'm going to overexpose each camera by 5 stops and 1 stop increments, and I think you'll be surprised by the results. And just as before, this scene is overexposed by 1 stop, so I dialed in a -1 EV on the exposure slider, and then I brought the highlights down to -100. Let's punch into the center. And again, just ignore the focusing, but I think both cameras did an excellent job at retaining the colors and detail. No problems here. Down here in the shadow area looks good. And then in the very dark shadows, just no noise at all. Just as we would expect. I think everything looks good here. All right, now we're 2 stops overexposed, and I'm starting to see the colors start to get a little bit muted at this point, but they still seem to be all there, more or less, but they are starting to lose kind of their richness, particularly the yellows. If we look in the center here, this block right here is actually yellow. If we look at the previous exposure, you can see the difference. Now let's go back. So this is both cameras overexposed by only 2 stops and then brought back. And you can see we lost quite a bit of color already. But let's just check the detail and the noise. And everything is fine here. Up in the corners, very good. And then over here, yeah, I think we're looking good otherwise. But definitely a pretty serious loss in terms of colors. Just even at just 2 stops. Now here at 3 stops, you can see we've lost even more color in the color tiles here. And if we punch in, you can see, you know, all these tiles look pretty gray except the ones that aren't. And we go down here, you look in the reflection here, where it's a little darker, you can see what color these tiles were supposed to be: red, orange, yellow, green. And on the Panasonic and the Olympus, these have all been grayed out pretty much. But the Olympus did retain a little bit more color right here on the green tile. And then if we go over to the left, you can see that this blue tile did retain some blue, whereas over here, these three tiles look all kind of whitish gray, versus on the Olympus, we do have some color retention left here on this blue and this green. But what really amazed me the most is look at the notepad here on the Olympus versus the Panasonic. The Olympus did a much better job at the highlight recovery. Now I can attribute some of this to the depth of field, but not that much, right? This is quite a stark difference here. And then if we go to this corner here on the Olympus camera, you can see, you can read all of the numbers here without too much difficulty. Whereas on the Panasonic, you can see everything's blown out all the way down. You can't read anything that's going on here. So really, the Olympus did an excellent job recovering highlights, and I'd give it definitely an edge over the Panasonic at 3 stops overexposed. Now at 4 stops, pretty much all of the color tiles have been grayed out. The notepad is totally blown out on both cameras, and all of the highlights are pretty much gone. You know, I know the shadow areas are going to be just perfectly fine, still good detail, and really it's pretty good detail across the board. Let's see how we did. Yeah, both cameras I would say are about the same at this point. Maybe a slight edge to the Olympus, because I can see the number 10 here, or 1. Over here I can't see anything. But if you're going to be shooting 4 or 5 stops overexposed and then trying to recover, you know, I think if you're shooting in black and white, you'll be perfectly fine, but definitely it would be a problem if you're trying to do color images. Now here's a quick look at the bracketed shots merged back together in an HDR process. And you can see both cameras recovered just fine. All of the highlights and color. There's no noise in the shadows. And certainly all the color looks really good. Now looking at a test scene is very different than taking a real world shot. So I just went out to my backyard right around sunset and took a couple of pictures, and I wanted to share with you because I noticed a couple other differences between these 2 cameras. Now I'm just going to jump to the underexposed shot by 3 stops, and one thing I noticed here is that the Panasonic shifted a little bit green when I underexposed the scene. Whereas the Olympus actually, I think, retained more accurate colors to the scene. And the way I can tell is based on this house here. If you look at the siding here is a very dark blue, gray kind of color, which is actually what it is to my eye. And then over here on the Panasonic, it's more of a blue-green. And I did try to adjust for white balance best I can. I tried a couple of different times with auto white balance, and I also tried to pick certain points in the image for white spots, like around the windowsill. And the results were the same every time. The Panasonic shifted just a tiny bit green when it was underexposed by 3 stops. But we still have a lot of noise, right, on the Olympus in the shadow areas, where you can make out all of the ivy and stuff growing on, and there's plenty of detail here still left in the bark. Versus on the Olympus, you know, it's all been kind of mushed out altogether. Now this is the same scene, but this time I overexposed by 2 stops, brought it back in post, and then also brought the highlights down to -100. And you can see that just like in the test shots, the Olympus did a little better job at retaining, especially the blue colors in the sky, and also in the yellows, as a matter of fact. If we look right here around this ring, right where the sun was setting, you can see there's still plenty of yellows and blues going on. Versus on the Panasonic, if you look in here, you can see this has all been blown out. There's no yellow in here or here. It's all white, then turns to gray. Like if we go right to this corner, look at how much better the Olympus did in this case in retaining the blues. versus the Panasonic, it's all been grayed out and blown out. Even down in here on this corner, you can see that the Olympus retained the yellows from the sun versus over here, they got blown out on the Panasonic. And then looking at 3 stops overexposed, you can see that both cameras have kind of blown out all of the blue colors all the way on the right side. But on the left side, the Olympus did a little better job at retaining the yellows and some of the blues a little better over in here. See, we're still blue here, and we still have some yellows and blues a little bit over in here, all the way down to right where the sun was setting. And then a final look at the bracketed shots merged together for HDR. And you can see that both cameras are looking pretty close again. And in particular, you'll notice the siding on the house now on the Panasonic is no longer like this blue-green, but it's more of what the color's supposed to be, just like it is on the Olympus. And then punching into the shadow detail, you can see now that the Olympus has brought back all of the detail in the ivy and the bark. I mean, the Panasonic still did a little better job, but these are close enough that I think with a little editing, you know, it'd be very hard to tell in a blind test which camera was which. I was really impressed with the Panasonic being able to recover 5 stops, which is very little noise. And I was equally impressed with the Olympus doing just a little better than the Panasonic in terms of recovering the colors from the highlights. Now that said, this is a test you can easily duplicate with your own camera in your own backyard. And when you understand the limits of your camera, you can go out and take images of these very high dynamic range scenes and tweak your exposure to get the most out of it. And if it's beyond those limits, all you have to do is bracket and merge them back together and you can get excellent results. So I hope you found this video helpful and informational. If so, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the like button. But either way, thanks for watching and hopefully we'll see you again soon.